I came off US 93 too fast the first time and drove right past the turn. That was the first thing that put me in a bad mood, and I was already in one before I got anywhere near Kingman. The van I was driving had a loose rattle in the dash, no insulation left in the driver door, and headlights that looked bright enough in town but felt weak once I got out into open desert. Everything past the highway looked flat and dead in the beam spread. Dirt, scrub, low rock, and long, dark gaps where the light didn't reach. I slowed down, checked the GPS again, and watched the blue line drift off to the right like it had made up its mind. I was somewhere else. The map said I'd already passed the turn by half a mile. Then it snapped back and said I was on top of it. Then it showed me cutting across empty ground that sure as hell didn't have a road on it. I pulled onto the shoulder, put it in park, and leaned over the wheel with the phone in my hand, squinting at the screen like that was going to make the signal behave. It didn't. I backed up, rolled forward, and caught the turn on the second pass. It wasn't a real road entrance, not the way most utility sites are marked. No decent sign, no gate reflector, nothing you could see at speed. Just two old utility posts set back from the edge of the highway with faded silver paint that barely flashed when my headlights hit them at the right angle. The dirt track between them looked like a wash at first, not something you were supposed to drive on. I eased the van onto it anyway. The front tires kicked loose gravel, then settled into hard-packed dirt with shallow ruts cut into it. The whole van shook. The dash rattle got worse. Wind pushed through the bad seal in the driver door and hissed against my left arm. It was dry wind, sharp and cold for Arizona, the kind that steals heat fast once the sun's gone. Every few seconds I saw sand skimming low across the track in thin sheets, moving left to right like smoke hugging the ground. Not a dust storm, not even close, just enough to make the road look like it was shifting under the headlights. I checked the phone again. The GPS arrow rotated, jittered, and slid sideways off the line. The road on the screen wandered out into blank ground, while my tires were still in the same ruts. I muttered to myself and tossed the phone onto the passenger seat. If dispatch wanted me out here, they could have at least sent a pin that worked, but I was already committed. I'd burned the gas, I'd made the drive, and I needed the money. That was the only thing I kept coming back to. It didn't matter that the van smelled like old coffee and hot plastic. It didn't matter that I hated overnight calls, or that I was running on gas station food and maybe 3 good hours of sleep. It didn't matter that the route out here looked like the kind of place people dumped junked appliances and forgot about them for 20 years. I needed the payout code from this job. I needed it before morning. I needed it so I could get to Tate's yard and get my truck back before he rolled the fees into another day. Every time the van bounced hard enough to jar my teeth, I pictured my pickup sitting behind chain link with my tool cases still locked in the bed. I pictured Tate looking at me over the office counter like I was wasting his time. That image kept my foot on the gas. The track curved once, then straightened. The desert opened wider on both sides, darker than it had any right to be. No houses, no traffic noise, no glow from town, just the beam spread, the wind, and the dry hiss of sand crossing the road in strips. The kind of dark where distance gets hard to judge, and everything looks farther away than it is. Then I saw the fence. It showed up as a dull line first, then the headlights caught the wire, and the posts one by one. A utility enclosure sat behind it, low and square and beige under a single exterior light. Red Mesa Relay Annex. The words were stenciled on a metal placard bolted to the fence, half scuffed but readable if you were close enough. The building itself looked small from the road, but there was enough equipment tucked around it to tell this wasn't some abandoned box in the desert. It was live. It was maintained. Somebody expected people to come out here. There was already an SUV parked near the gate, white with county markings on the door. Engine off, headlights off, just sitting there like it had been waiting. I pulled up behind it and killed the van. The sudden quiet made the wind sound louder. It moved across the fence and over the roofline in a dry, steady rush. Sand ticked lightly against the lower panels of the van. I sat there for a second with both hands on the wheel, looking at the building through the windshield, and telling myself, one more time, that this was a relay support call. In and out. Log the work, get paid, leave. The driver door of the SUV opened and a woman stepped out. Tall, jacket zipped up, posture straight even in the wind. She shut the door with one hand and came toward the gate without hurrying, like she'd done this enough times to know exactly how long everything took. I got out and met her at the fence line. "Wade Barrett?" she asked. "Yeah, dispatch sent me," I said. "You're late. Follow me," she said flatly. She unlocked the chain, pulled the gate wide with both hands, and stepped back while I climbed into the van again. Then she went to her SUV, and I rolled through the opening with my headlights sweeping across the dirt yard, the relay building, and the dark space behind it where the light didn't reach. I hadn't planned on being out there that night. I hadn't planned on being anywhere except my apartment, eating leftovers out of a plastic container and trying to figure out what I could put off paying until Friday. My place in Bullhead City was the kind of rental you take because it's close enough to the highway and the landlord doesn't ask for much up front. 1 bedroom, old wall unit AC, carpet that never really looked clean no matter how much you vacuumed it. The kitchen light buzzed if you left it on too long. The bathroom door stuck in the summer. It wasn't much, but it was cheap, and cheap beat comfortable when contractor work got thin. That was the part nobody tells you when they say independent work pays better. It does, on the good weeks. On the bad weeks, it's silence. No calls, no tickets, no overnight dispatches, no little emergency jobs that fill the gaps. You sit there refreshing your phone, pretending you're taking a night off while the bills keep moving like they always do. Rent doesn't care if dispatch is slow. Gas doesn't care. Insurance doesn't care. I'd been in one of those stretches for almost 2 weeks, taking small jobs, short jobs, anything they sent me that didn't already have 3 guys fighting over it. The truck getting towed was what pushed it from annoying to urgent. It happened on SR 95 near Fort Mojave, late afternoon, right when traffic starts stacking up with people heading home and everybody gets impatient at the lights. I was in my pickup, coming back from a short equipment check, and the guy in front of me stopped hard for a left turn he almost missed. I hit the brakes, but not fast enough on loose grit. I bumped his rear bumper, not a big crash, no airbags, no ambulance. Just enough to crack his taillight and bend my front corner in, the kind of thing that ruins your whole week anyway. The cop who showed up wrote it up, looked at my registration, and then at the expired sticker I'd been putting off dealing with, because I figured I had 1 more month. I didn't. Between that and the insurance issue still processing, he had the truck towed. I stood there on the shoulder with my tool bag in the bed, and watched the wrecker haul away the one thing I actually needed to make money. Most of my good gear was still in that truck. Meter kit, adapters, spare patch leads, gloves. The little hard case with all the stuff you don't think about until you need exactly 1 piece of it at midnight, 50 miles from anywhere. I had backup tools at the apartment, enough to get through basic work if I had to, but not the setup I trusted. By the time I got home, I was already doing math in my head. Tow fee, storage, registration fix, insurance hold, gas. I had enough to cover 1 problem, maybe 2 if I got lucky, and I wasn't feeling lucky. Tate Hollis called before I even finished heating my food. I let it ring twice because I knew who it was. Mojave Tow and Hold. His number came up enough over the years that I didn't need to read the screen. Tate ran the yard like a man who'd heard every excuse in the county and stopped believing all of them 10 years ago. I picked up on the 3rd ring and put him on speaker while I stirred the container in the microwave. "You want the truck back by morning? Pay me before 8, Tate said. "I'm working on it," I told him. "Working on it doesn't stop storage fees," he said flatly. That was Tate. No threats, no yelling, no fake politeness, just the numbers and the clock. He gave me the total again, item by item, like he was reading off a menu. Tow, intake, yard storage, admin fee. Then he told me what it would be after 8 a.m. when the next day kicked in. He didn't have to add anything else. I knew what he meant. Miss the window and the total jumped. Miss another day and it jumped again. I told him I'd call him back and hung up before the microwave finished. The food came out hot in spots and cold in the middle. I ate half of it standing at the counter and threw the rest away because my stomach had already tied itself up. I was rinsing the fork when Sierra called. Sierra Nolan handled after-hours dispatch for one of the contractors I worked under. She wasn't rude exactly. She just sounded like she'd already moved on to the next problem before you finished answering the first one. If there was an overnight ticket nobody wanted, Sierra was usually the voice attached to it. She got right to it. Relay support call, near Kingman, county access site, basic hardware check and log completion, hazard hold included if the site log was closed before 6 a.m. The way she said it, like she was reading from a script she'd used 100 times, made it sound routine. The hazard part landed a little strange, but hazard pay gets attached to all kinds of things: weather, remote location, wildlife, security. I didn't stop her to ask. I did ask the only thing that mattered. "How much?" I asked. There was a pause, paper shifting on her end, keyboard clicks. "Enough to make it worth the drive if you finish the site log before 6, she said. That was Sierra, too. Never the full answer if she didn't have to give it, but it told me enough. She knew I was deciding based on the number. She knew the number would get me moving if she framed it the right way. And she was right. I looked at the time, looked at the sink, looked at the empty spot outside my building where the truck should have been. Then I asked the question I actually cared about. "I've got a relay support call near Kingman. If you finish before 6, I can clear a same-night release code," Sierra said. For a second, I thought she was asking me something she already knew, and then I realized she was confirming the payment release process, not the job. She wanted me to say yes so dispatch had it on the call. I leaned against the counter and rubbed my forehead. "Yeah," I said, and she kept going before I could say anything else. She gave me the site name, Red Mesa Relay Annex, and a rough route from US 93. Said county liaison would meet me at the gate and provide access. Said to bring ID, log the equipment, and follow the site instructions. Her tone stayed flat the whole time, like she was listing office supply counts instead of sending someone into the desert after dark. I asked if the signal issue at the site was serious. She said the work order showed a support module fault and a pending maintenance check, nothing major. I asked if there was a key or lockbox. She said the liaison handled entry. Then she repeated the part about the site instructions, slower this time, like it mattered more than the hardware. That stuck with me, but not enough to talk myself out of it. I told her I'd take it. Once I said yes, everything sped up. I started pulling backup gear from the hall closet in the plastic bin under my bed. It was a thinner setup than I liked. Basic meter, spare leads, flashlight, gloves, notepad, charger, a couple of hand tools. I kept reaching for things that weren't there and then remembering they were still in the truck bed behind Tate's fence. I packed what I had anyway and kept moving. The rental van was from a local fleet place I used when my truck was in the shop. I still had the key because I'd dropped it late on another job the week before and they hadn't checked it back in yet. It was old, white, and ugly, but it ran. I grabbed the key, my jacket, and the folder Sierra had sent to my email, then headed out. The hallway outside my apartment smelled like old dust and somebody's laundry soap. The air outside was colder than I expected. I locked the door, stood there for a second, and checked my account balance on my phone one more time, like the number might have changed in the last 10 minutes. It hadn't. I drove across town, picked up the van, and sat in the lot long enough to punch the route into my GPS. The pin loaded, then shifted, then settled again. I remember looking at the map and thinking the route seemed longer than it should have been for a relay support call. Then I thought about the truck, the fees, and the time on the clock, and I put the van in gear. By the time I got out toward the highway, I was already irritated, already tired, and already telling myself I'd be back before sunrise with enough money to keep the week from getting worse. That was the whole plan. Drive up, do the work, close the log, get paid, get the truck. I didn't know anything about Red Mesa yet. I didn't know what the site instructions were. I just knew I couldn't afford to say no, so I headed north into the dark. Inside the fence, the yard was bigger than it looked from the road, but not by much. My headlights swept over packed dirt, a narrow gravel strip, and the relay building sitting in the middle like a concrete box somebody dropped out there and forgot. The exterior light over the front door threw a yellow cone across the steel steps and part of the wall, then faded into black. There were no other lights in the yard except what came off my van and Brandy's SUV. I parked where she pointed, near the front corner of the building, and killed the engine. The sudden quiet made the wind sound louder. It moved across the fence and roofline with a dry scraping sound. Sand ticked against the lower panels of the van. I sat there for a second with both hands on the wheel, then grabbed my backup tool case and got out. Brandy was already at the door. Up close, the building looked newer than the road leading to it. Beige utility siding, steel door, a two-step steel stair bolted to a small concrete pad, and a camera mounted under the light. A faded site ID placard sat beside the handle. Nothing about it looked abandoned. It looked maintained, active, and expensive enough that somebody checked on it regularly. She unlocked the door and pulled it open. I stepped past her and caught a quick look around the right side of the building while I crossed the threshold. Behind the structure, I could see a low metal access housing near the ground, bolted shut and half buried in dirt and stone. It looked like service access for conduit or a crawl space. I didn't think much about it. It was just another utility feature, the kind of thing you stop noticing after enough night jobs. The room inside was compact and colder than I expected. It smelled like dust, metal, and old electronics. A relay cabinet took up most of the back wall. To the right was a gray power panel with clean labels and a digital display mounted above it. On the left wall sat a ventilation unit with a caged fan and a duct run up toward the ceiling. Near the front was a folding table with a logbook, a clipboard, a landline phone, and a pen chained to a metal base. There was one rolling chair, one trash can, and not much else. What stood out was how clean it was. No wire scraps, no tape rolls, no dead batteries, no coffee cups, no old parts left in a corner. Most relay sites collect clutter no matter how careful the day crews are. This one looked like somebody reset the room after every shift. Brandy stepped in behind me, shut the door, and locked it before she said anything. Then she walked past me without asking for the work order or looking at my tools. She went straight to the power panel and checked the digital display above it. She held her eyes there for a second, then looked at the wall clock near the ventilation unit. It was a quick comparison, like she was making sure the two matched. That got my attention. I've had site liaisons point out breaker locations, access codes, bad lights, camera blind spots, all of it. I'd never seen one come in and check the time first like that. It felt like she was tracking something that mattered more than the equipment fault I was there to fix. I set my tool case on the folding table and pulled up the work order on my phone. I still had weak signal then. I was halfway through the fault note when Brandy reached into her jacket and pulled out a folded sheet of copier paper. No clipboard, no county logo, no heading. She held it out to me. "Read it first," Brandy said. I took the page and unfolded it. It was one sheet typed with 5 numbered lines and no other information. The print looked soft around the edges, like it had been photocopied too many times. I read the first line, then the second, and by the time I got to the 5th, I looked up at her. "What is this?" I asked. "Site rules," she said flatly. I looked back down. The wording wasn't normal. It wasn't safety language or lockout procedure, or anything I recognized from utility work. It was specific in a different way. It talked about timing, movement, and conditions like somebody had written instructions for a machine I couldn't see. Keep the rear service hatch closed at all times. Don't open it after 1:30 a.m. If sand reaches the bottom step at the front door, close the inner shutters immediately. If you hear exactly 3 knocks from below the floor, cut main power for 10 seconds, then restore it. After 3 a.m., don't drag tools, chairs, or cables across the floor. Lift them or leave them. At 4:17 a.m., keep both feet off the floor until the ventilation fan restarts. I read it again, slower this time, expecting a 6th line that explained why any of it mattered. There wasn't one. No dust event procedure, no wildlife intrusion, no ground vibration warning. Just those 5 rules, written like they were as ordinary as a sign telling you to wash your hands. For a relay station? I asked. Brandy didn't react. No smile, no shrug, no annoyed look. She just stood there, shoulders squared, waiting for me to finish reading like this happened every time. Then she tapped the page with one finger. "Read them back exactly," she repeated. I stared at her for a second, then started reading out loud. The room felt quieter once I started, like the fan and cabinet hum dropped back a little. Maybe it was just me paying too much attention. I read the first rule. She gave a short nod. I read the second and skipped bottom before step. She stopped me with a small shake of her head. I started over and said, "Bottom step." Third rule, I said 3 knocks, and she stopped me again. I had to read it with exactly 3 knocks. On the 5th rule, I read until the fan restarts, and she corrected me before I finished the line. She wanted the full wording. Until the ventilation fan restarts. It was the kind of correction a trainer makes when wording matters legally, or when they've watched someone get it wrong before. I read all 5 again, word for word, and she listened without moving. When I finished, she held out her hand. I thought she wanted the page back, but she kept her hand there and pointed toward my jacket pocket. "Keep the paper on you. Do your work first," she told me. I folded the sheet and slipped it into my jacket. It felt ridiculous, but arguing wasn't going to get the job done faster. I wanted her gone so I could swap the module, log the work, and leave before I got any more weird site instructions. Brandy crossed to the table and looked at the logbook without opening it. Then she checked the wall clock again. Same quick glance, same blank expression. She still hadn't asked for my ID, and she still hadn't mentioned the actual relay fault. I opened the work order on my phone again and read the fault note just to hear something normal in my own head. Support module alert, maintenance check pending, county access required, standard wording, nothing about sand, nothing about the floor, nothing about a fan restart at 4:17. Brandy unlocked the front door and opened it. Wind pushed into the room right away, dry and cold, carrying dust with it. She stepped outside, then paused and looked back in, not at me exactly, more at the room as a whole. Her eyes moved from the cabinet to the floor to the vent, then to the table, like she was confirming the setup. Then she pulled the door shut from the outside. I heard the lock catch. Her boots hit the steel steps, then dirt. A few seconds later, I heard the SUV door open and close. The engine started. Headlights swept across the front wall through the seams around the door, then shifted away as she drove toward the gate. I stood there in the middle of the room with my backup tool case on the table and a photocopied rule sheet in my jacket pocket, listening to the relay cabinet hum and the wind scrape across the outside of the building. The wall clock ticked loud enough to notice now. The ventilation fan was off. I told myself it was county liability procedure, remote site dust protocol, some local workaround they gave every overnight contractor so nobody panicked and sued them later. I'd seen stranger paperwork in this line of work. I took my jacket off, kept the rule sheet in it, and hung it over the back of the chair. Then I picked up my tool case, set it by the relay cabinet, and crouched down to start the only part of the night that still made sense. The relay cabinet was a standard outdoor support rack, cleaner than most of the ones I worked on and laid out in a way that told me the day crew either cared or got checked on by someone who did. Labels were straight, patch lines were bundled and tied, the faulting unit from the work order sat in the middle of the rack, a support switch module with one amber indicator lit steady on the faceplate. Everything around it was green. That helped. A blinking fault light on familiar hardware was the kind of problem I could solve without thinking too hard. And after the drive and the weird paper in my jacket pocket, not thinking too hard sounded good. I set my tool case down, popped it open, and started laying things out by habit. Meter, flashlight, small driver, spare patch leads, notepad. I checked the work order one more time on my phone and matched the listed module ID to the label on the rack. It matched. Good. If the site note had sent me to the wrong unit, I would have lost 20 minutes right there. I put the meter on the feed and checked voltage first. Stable. No sag, no weird bounce, no sign the power side was doing anything strange. Then I checked the ports on the faceplate and the link lights on the patch lines. The uplink wasn't dropping, but the module was flagging an internal support fault, same as dispatch had written. It looked like exactly what it was supposed to be, a routine swap on an aging unit. I powered the module down, waited for the status lights to clear, and started disconnecting patch lines one at a time. I laid them in order across the cabinet edge so I wouldn't have to fight my own work on the way back in. Port 1, port 2, all the way across. The cable jackets were warm in my hand from being live a minute earlier. I pulled the mounting screws, slid the module out, and set it on a folded rag on the floor. The replacement unit in my case wasn't brand new, but it was clean and sealed, pulled from a verified stock bin. I checked the serial against the packing label, then slid it into the slot and seated it flush. Screws back in. Patch lines back in the same order I pulled them. Feed reconnected. I kept my movements slow and neat because rushing is how you bend a pin or force a connector and turn a 30-minute call into an all-night one. Once everything was seated, I powered the module back up and watched the indicators cycle. Amber, blink, green, test sequence, then all green except one line that lagged for a few seconds before catching up. I waited another minute and checked the meter again just to be sure. Stable. No voltage drop, no odd heat, no smell from the unit. I ran a quick local check from the front controls and got a clean response. Routine. I grabbed my notepad and wrote the old serial, the replacement serial, and the install time. Then I opened the site logbook on the folding table and found the next empty line. The entries above it were short and mechanical, same kind of notes I'd write on any overnight call. Date, time, initials, module ID, basic condition, a few mentions of fan checks, a few mentions of door seals, nothing that explained the rule sheet. I wrote my name, the work order number, and the module swap note, then left the final sign-off line open in case I needed to add a status check before sunrise. The ventilation fan kicked on while I was writing. It made a rough start, like the bearings complained for half a second, then it leveled out into a steady spin. I looked over my shoulder at the unit on the left wall. Air moved through the room, not strong, but enough to stir the dry smell of dust and electronics. I glanced at the wall clock. Didn't think much of it. Fans cycle. That's what they do. It shut off less than a minute later. I looked back at the vent and waited. The room was still cool. The relay cabinet wasn't putting off enough heat to drive a quick cycle, not in a room that size. The fan came on again maybe 40 seconds after that, ran for another short burst, then shut off. That was odd. I stood there listening through another cycle and started timing it in my head. It wasn't responding to temperature. The room temp didn't change enough for that, and the runtime was too short. It felt like a timed pattern, almost like a relay pulse, on and off at fixed intervals. Not clean enough to be a modern programmed HVAC loop, but not random either. "This all for one module swap?" I muttered. I set the pen down and walked to the vent unit for a closer look. No obvious damage on the cage, no loose panel screws. The thermostat housing on the wall looked old, scratched cover, yellowing around the edges, but the dial hadn't moved. I put the back of my hand near the airflow when it came on again. Cool air. Then it cut out. I told myself it wasn't my problem unless the work order said it was. I'd already fixed the listed fault. If the fan was on some weird timing circuit, County could deal with it on day shift. I went back to the table, reached for my phone, and saw there were no bars. That got my attention more than the fan. I held the phone up, moved near the door, waited. Nothing. The signal had been weak when I came in, but it had been there. I opened the work order email anyway. It hung for a second, then loaded from cache. I closed it and checked the camera monitor mounted above the table instead. I hadn't touched it yet, but the screen was on, split into two exterior views. Front step and side yard. Grainy black and white feed, but usable. The front camera showed the steel steps and a slice of the dirt yard in the wash of the exterior light. At first, I thought the image had noise in it. Then I realized the noise was sand moving. It wasn't blowing past in a constant stream. It was gathering. Little low pushes of it skimming in from the dark and stacking against the concrete pad under the steps. The wind outside was steady, but the sand in the camera view moved in short bursts, then stopped, then pushed again. It looked less like drifting and more like somebody nudging it from farther out. I leaned closer to the monitor, then looked toward the door. There was a narrow seam under it, and I could hear the wind outside a little clearer now, but not stronger. Nothing about the sound matched what I was seeing on the screen. The pile at the front step thickened another inch in one short shove, then held. "No wonder they pay hazard," I said. I stood there with my hand on the table, watching the front camera for maybe 30 seconds, maybe more. The sand line crept up the concrete pad in uneven pushes. It reached the base of the steel stair, swirled there, then climbed. Not fast, not dramatic, just deliberate enough that I stopped pretending it was normal wind drift. I remembered the paper in my jacket pocket and turned to look at the chair where I'd hung it. Rule 2. If sand reaches the bottom step at the front door, close the inner shutters immediately. The station had inner shutters over the front glass panels, narrow metal slats recessed into the wall on each side of the door. I hadn't paid attention to them when I walked in, because plenty of sites have storm shutters. I looked back at the monitor. The sand rose again and touched the first steel tread, exactly where the rule said. I didn't move right away. I just stood there, half annoyed and half cold in the stomach, waiting for a normal explanation to show up in my head. A gust pattern, a pressure shift, some weird venting effect from the building footprint. The sand pushed again and spread across the bottom step. "Fine," I said, and pulled the inner shutters closed. The slats dropped with a metal rattle and snapped into place over the front glass. The change in the room was immediate. The outside wind didn't go silent, but it went dull, like somebody stuffed insulation into my ears. The relay cabinet hum sounded heavier. The room pressure shifted just enough that I felt it in my sinuses, a faint inward pinch that passed in a second. The station felt sealed after that, not just shut, sealed, like the shutters were more than light covers. I stood there with my hand still on the shutter strap, listening to the fan click on, then off, then on again. "That felt wrong," I muttered. I let the strap go and stepped back toward the table. The floor under my boots gave me the first hint of it then. Not movement exactly, more like a faint pulse through the soles. A soft thump, so light I could have blamed my own heartbeat if I'd been sitting down. Then another one a few seconds later. I looked at the relay cabinet, then the power panel, then the ventilation unit. Fan cycle, cabinet hum, old building, bolted steel stairs, all the things a tired brain reaches for when it wants a reason. I took one more step toward the cabinet and felt it again, a little clearer this time, a low pulse under the concrete, gone before I could decide if I'd imagined it. Then a small knock came from beneath the floor. I froze and listened. The sound didn't come again right away. The relay cabinet hummed. The ventilation fan clicked on, ran for a short burst, then shut off. Wind pressed against the building outside in a low, dry rush behind the shutters. I stood there trying to place what I'd heard, and then it came again. Knock. A hollow hit from under the floor, somewhere near the base of the relay cabinet. Then a third one, same spacing, same force. 3. Exactly 3. I didn't need to pull the paper back out to know which rule that was. My body had already gone cold before my brain caught up. I turned to the power panel so fast I clipped my knee on the corner of the table. The panel was to the right of the cabinet, gray steel door, clean labels, no mystery there. I yanked it open and found the main breaker at the top. The rule said 10 seconds. It didn't say count slow or fast. It didn't say what happened if you missed. I flipped it down. The room went dark except for the little standby glow on the camera monitor and one faint status light on the landline base. The relay cabinet hum died. The ventilation fan cut off mid-cycle. The silence that followed was thick enough that I could hear the blood in my ears. I counted in my head with my hand still on the breaker handle. 1, 2, 3. The floor felt dead under my boots for the first time since I'd closed the shutters. 4, 5, 6. I kept waiting for another knock, or for something to hit the walls, or for the fan to kick on by itself. 7, 8, 9, 10. I flipped the breaker back up. The lights came on with a hard fluorescent buzz. The relay cabinet rebooted into its steady hum. The fan stayed off for a beat, then clicked on and ran longer than it had before, a full, clean cycle instead of those short, choppy bursts. I stood there with the panel open, breathing harder than I should have been, and waited for the floor pulse. It didn't stop completely, but it dropped. What I'd been feeling through my boots turned from a low, repeating thump into something so faint I had to stand still to notice it. I looked at the camera monitor and saw the sand piled at the front step, but it wasn't climbing anymore. It sat there in a red-gray drift at the lower tread and stayed put. I stared at the monitor, then at the power panel, then at the folded jacket hanging on the chair with the rule sheet in the pocket. The rule had worked. I didn't understand how. I didn't understand what I'd just interrupted by cutting power, or why 10 seconds mattered, or why a relay annex in the desert had a floor that knocked back. But the sequence on the page had changed what the room was doing. That part was hard to argue with. I shut the panel door and went back to the table. My hands were steady, which bothered me almost as much as the knocks. I should have been more rattled. Instead, I felt the way I feel on complicated jobs when something doesn't make sense, but the first test gives you a result. Not calm, focused. I pulled my jacket off the chair, took the paper out, and read all 5 rules again. Same wording, same cheap print. No header, no explanation. It looked even dumber under the fluorescent lights than it had 5 minutes earlier, and somehow a lot less optional. I put the page in my front pocket this time instead of the jacket, and sat down in the rolling chair facing the table and camera monitor. I wasn't done with the job on paper, not really. I still needed to watch the replacement module run clean for a while and sign off the log, but I'd already fixed the listed fault. Everything else now was waiting, listening, and pretending this was still normal enough to bill. The fan cycled again, longer run, cleaner stop, then a longer pause. I started timing it against the wall clock without meaning to. It wasn't a temperature cycle, it was a pattern. Not perfectly even, but close enough that I could feel when it drifted. The more I listened, the more it sounded like the fan wasn't cooling the room so much as maintaining some kind of rhythm. I hated that thought. It sounded like the kind of thing people say after they've been alone too long in the dark. I pushed it aside and opened the logbook again. I started reading more carefully this time. The entries looked like maintenance notes at first, but the details were off. Different names, different nights, same pattern. They kept mentioning the sand reaching the step, the shutters getting closed, and the knocks under the floor. There were notes about cutting main power for 10 seconds, then bringing it back. More than one entry mentioned the fan restarting at 4:17, like that was the part that mattered most. One page had almost nothing about relay equipment at all. Just notes about the floor, the fan timing, and the hatch staying quiet that night. Another entry mentioned a delayed fan restart and no module work performed. That one made me stop. No module work performed. It was written in the same log, same columns, same sign-off line as the relay jobs. Whoever wrote it had been there for the site, not the equipment. I flipped back another page and found the same kind of thing again. Floor knocks, fan restart timing, door seals checked after sunrise, barely a word about the relay hardware. I closed the book and sat there staring at the cover. The room was still the room. Cabinet humming, fan cycling, wind outside. My replacement module was online and stable, but the log read like I'd walked into a shift system that happened to use a relay station as cover. The equipment notes were there because they had to be there. The real record was all the stuff from the rule sheet. I checked my phone again. No signal, not even a flicker. That made the landline on the table look more useful than it had when I first came in. I picked up the handset and listened. Dial tone, clean, no static. Sierra answered on the third ring. Same voice, same clipped pace, like she'd been expecting either me or someone exactly like me at this hour. 3 knocks from under the floor, I said. Then do exactly what the paper says, Sierra said. I gripped the handset tighter and looked at the relay cabinet while she talked, just to keep my eyes on something I understood. What is this place? I asked. Finish your shift, Wade, she said flatly. I leaned back in the chair and looked at the wall clock. The fan clicked on again. That's not an answer, I told her. It's the only one you're getting tonight, she said. I should have hung up on her right there. I thought about it. I thought about grabbing my tool case and walking out, rules or no rules, and dealing with Tate in the morning however I had to. But I could still feel the difference in the floor after the breaker cut. I'd seen the sand stop climbing. Something in this room responded to those rules, whether Sierra explained it or not. I looked toward the back wall, remembering the low metal access housing I'd seen outside when I came in. I hadn't heard anything from that side yet. I almost kept that to myself. Then there was a faint metallic tick from the rear wall, so soft I might have missed it if the fan hadn't just shut off. Then another. A short scrape, pressure and release. I stayed in the chair, phone pressed to my ear, eyes on the back wall. The hatch in the back moved, I said. Leave it closed, she told me. That was it. No hesitation. No, what did you hear? No, how much movement? She already knew what the right answer was because she knew what the question meant. The line went dead a second later. I set the handset back in the cradle and listened to the room. The fan cycled on, ran, cut off. The relay cabinet stayed steady. The back wall gave another soft metal tick, like something nudged the underside of a lid and let go. Everything in me wanted to inspect it. That's the work. You hear a metal panel move, you go check if a fastener backed out or a conduit's rattling or some animal crawled where it shouldn't. You don't sit in a chair and wait for it to happen again. But the paper in my pocket felt heavier than before, and Sierra's voice had taken the choice out of it. Leave it closed. So I stayed inside. I watched the monitor. The front steps stayed buried to the same line. I watched the wall clock and started tracking the fan cycles more carefully, counting under my breath without saying the numbers out loud. The pattern held, mostly. Every once in a while, the start lagged by a second, then corrected on the next cycle. The floor pulse stayed faint, The metallic movement at the rear wall came and went in little taps, never enough to call a knock, never loud enough to pretend I didn't hear it. At some point I stopped thinking about the relay module entirely. I'd done the work. The hardware was fine. I was there for something else now, whether dispatch admitted it or not. The wall clock crept past 3. I reached for the logbook to make a note about the module status and used my foot to pull the rolling chair a little closer to the table. The wheels scraped across the concrete a few inches before I realized what I'd done. The scrape was barely anything, a few inches of cheap wheels on concrete. If it had happened an hour earlier, I wouldn't have noticed it over the fan and the cabinet hum. But it was after 3. I felt it before I even remembered why. My stomach dropped, and I stopped moving with my hand still on the logbook. The sound of the chair wheels seemed to hang in the room a second longer than it should have, like the floor carried it farther than the air did. I pulled the folded sheet out of my pocket and read Rule 4 again, even though I already knew what it said. After 3 a.m., don't drag tools, chairs, or cables across the floor. Lift them or leave them. I looked at the chair. It had moved maybe 4 inches. I just moved the chair, I muttered. I set the paper on the table. Keeping one finger on it like that changed anything. The relay cabinet hummed. The fan clicked on and ran through another cycle. The back wall stayed quiet. Come on, that's not enough to matter, I said. I wanted that to be true badly enough that I almost believed it. A rule like that sounded like superstition anyway. Don't drag things. Fine. Maybe it was about vibration. Maybe there were old conduit runs under the slab and somebody once cracked one by shoving a tool chest around. That's what I told myself while I watched the wall clock and waited for the room to prove me right. The floor pulse hit 2 seconds later, stronger than before. It came up through my boots in a slow, heavy thump, then another one, then a third, spaced farther apart than the knocks had been, but deep enough now that I felt it in my shins. The relay cabinet vibrated against the wall for half a second and settled. The fan shut off at the wrong point in its cycle, not a clean cut, more like it lost momentum and coasted down. I stood up so fast, the chair rolled back on its own and bumped the wall. The next fan restart came late. I was watching the clock now, counting silently, and it missed the rhythm I'd been tracking by at least a few beats. When it finally kicked on, it sounded rougher, a dry grind before the blades caught speed. It ran short, then stopped again. The timing was slipping. I put my palm against the relay cabinet and felt a faint tremor through the metal skin. The replacement module was still online. All the status lights were green. The hardware fault wasn't back. Whatever had changed, it wasn't the module. A metallic pop came from the rear wall, then a low scrape. I turned toward the back and heard it again, louder this time, not just a tick. Pressure under metal. Release. The kind of sound a bolted panel makes when something underneath leans into it and drops away. I grabbed my flashlight and crossed halfway to the back wall before I remembered Rule 1. Keep the rear service hatch closed at all times. Don't open it after 1:30 a.m. The access housing was outside, not inside the room, but the sound was coming through the back wall clear enough now that I could picture exactly where it was. My hand tightened on the flashlight. Every instinct I had said go outside, look at the hatch, see what's pushing it, check if a bracket's failing or a line's come loose. Then, the seam at the base of the rear wall hissed, and a thin stream of red sand slid into the room. I stopped cold. It didn't pour in. It bled in through a gap where the wall met the floor, a narrow line at first, then another line a foot over. Fine red grains spread across the concrete and settled in tiny fans. A second later, I heard the rear hatch pop again, harder than before, and more sand came under the wall in a soft rush. It mattered, I said when the hatch lifted again. I backed up 2 steps and aimed the flashlight beam low. The red sand looked brighter in the light than the stuff at the front step, almost rust-colored. It moved in little tremors when the floor pulse hit, each thump sending a faint ripple through the grains before they settled again. The hatch sounded like it was lifting in short pushes now, Metal flex, drop, metal flex, drop. Not enough to break free, but enough to tell me something underneath had leverage. Not opening it? No way, I muttered. I moved back to the table and started getting things off the floor. My tool case was still by the relay cabinet. I reached for the handle, then caught myself when I almost pulled it across the concrete. Rule 4 again. I bent, lifted it clean, and set it on the folding table next to the logbook. I picked up the spare lead pouch, flashlight batteries, and the rag I'd used earlier. Everything went up high. I pulled the trash can off the floor and set it by the wall. Another pulse hit, harder. The chair wheels rattled. Sand started coming in under the front door, too. I could see it in the edge of my flashlight beam, slipping through the bottom seam in a thin line and spreading toward the table legs. The shutters were still closed. The wind outside sounded the same, but the sand inside moved in those same little pushes, not a steady drift. I looked at the vent. The fan should have started already. It didn't. I counted another few beats, then it kicked on late, sputtered, ran for a short burst and stopped. That was when Rule 5 stopped sounding random. At 4:17 a.m., keep both feet off the floor until the ventilation fan restarts. It wasn't until the room settles, or for 1 minute, or any of the things you'd write if you wanted a person to guess. It tied the floor directly to the fan. The fan restart was the marker. If the fan timing slipped, then 4:17 got worse. I checked the wall clock. Still time, but not much. The room knocked again, not from the rear wall this time, from under the floor, left side of the table. 3 hits, hollow, evenly spaced. Exactly 3. I was already moving when the third one landed. I hit the power panel, flipped the main breaker down, and the room dropped into darkness. The monitor standby glow stayed on. The landline light stayed dim. Everything else went dead. I counted with both hands on the panel edge this time, leaning in, listening hard. At 3 seconds, the whole station gave one long inward groan. At 5, the floor dipped under me just enough to shift my balance. At 7, the walls made a low creak from the back corners, not loud, but deep, like the building frame was taking weight from underneath and trying not to show it. At 9, I heard a heavy, dull scrape from under the slab, moving from the rear wall toward the center of the room. I hit 10 and flipped the breaker back up. The lights came back. The relay cabinet resumed its hum. The fan didn't start. I stared at it and waited. The floor pulse dropped, but not as much as the first time. The red sand stopped advancing for a second, then crept another inch under the back wall and door seam. The hatch noise faded to intermittent taps, but it didn't go quiet. The second breaker cut helped. It just didn't reset things all the way. That scared me more than the knocks. It meant the rules weren't magic. They were controls, procedures. They reduced something. They bought time. But if the timing slipped far enough, they didn't put it back where it started. I looked around the room and started seeing everything differently. Relay cabinet, power panel, ventilation unit, clean floor, steel walls, rear hatch outside, the log entries, the fan restart note, the rule about not dragging weight after 3, the rule about getting your feet off the floor at exactly 4:17. This wasn't just a relay station with weird local protocols. The relay gear was part of it. The load draw, the cycling, the power interruptions, the fan timing, all of it was tied into whatever sat under the slab. Maybe not by design when the site was first built. Maybe somebody figured it out after. I didn't know, but I knew a normal relay annex wouldn't care if I moved a chair 4 inches. I looked at the replacement module in the cabinet, and then at the floor, where the red sand shifted in tiny rings with each pulse. This isn't about the relay, I said. Saying it out loud made the room feel smaller. I stepped closer to the cabinet and put my hand on the metal again, feeling the vibration. The relay load was steady. The fan cycle was not. The breaker cut had changed the floor response both times. The rules weren't random at all. They were a sequence for keeping the site stable through a window of time, and they'd handed it to me disguised as a maintenance handoff because that was easier than explaining any of it. "They're using the relay load to hold something down," I said. The words sounded insane. They also fit everything in front of me better than any other explanation I had. The fan clicked on late again and ran rough. Sand hissed under the back wall in another short push. The hatch popped once, hard enough this time that dust shook loose from the seam where the rear wall met the ceiling. I checked the wall clock. The minute hand was edging toward 4. I looked up from the clock to the overhead cable tray running across the room, steel mesh bolted into the ceiling joists above the relay cabinet and table, and for the first time all night I started planning where I'd need to put my hands. I moved fast after that, but not sloppy. The chair was still by the table, and I wasn't about to make the same mistake twice. I bent, grabbed the seat in the backrest, and lifted it clear of the floor. The wheels spun in the air while I carried it under the overhead cable tray. I set it down carefully, no scrape, no drag, and nudged it into place with my hands until it sat just left of the power panel. The tray ran across the room in a straight line, steel mesh, bolted into the ceiling with brackets every few feet. It held bundled cables and looked strong enough to take weight for a minute or two, maybe longer if I kept my center under it. I didn't love the idea of hanging from it, but Rule 5 didn't leave me a lot of room to improvise. I got everything else off the floor. Tool case on the table, flashlight on top of the logbook, spare leads and gloves on the chair seat until I realized the chair might need to be under me clean. Then I moved them to the cabinet shelf. I checked the floor around the table legs and saw red sand already spread in thin fans from the front door and rear wall, with little ridges where each pulse had pushed it forward. It was in the corners now, under the cabinet. Around the trash can I'd moved. The fan clicked on late, ran rough, then cut off again. I stepped to the ventilation unit and pulled the front service cover. It stuck at one corner, then came loose. Inside was a simple control board, older than the relay gear, with a fuse, a contactor, and a manual reset tab set low on the right side. Not labeled in any helpful way, just a red plastic tab next to a small metal arm. I traced the line with my flashlight, then looked at the wall clock and measured the distance with my eyes. From the chair to the cable tray, I could get both hands up. From the tray, I might be able to drop one arm and reach the fan panel if I swung a little and braced a foot against the wall. It would be ugly, and if the floor started moving hard, I might not get a second try. The thought of the floor moving harder stopped being hypothetical when the rear hatch hit from outside. One solid metal pop from the back wall, louder than anything before it. Dust shook loose from the seam near the ceiling. Red sand came under the rear wall in a fresh rush and spread across the concrete in a wide tongue. The floor pulse followed a second later, heavy enough to make the relay cabinet buzz in place. I checked the clock again. Minutes. I put the fan cover on the table instead of dropping it. I kept doing little things like that, handling everything too carefully, because the room had stopped feeling like a room and started feeling like a test I was already halfway behind on. The fan didn't start on the next cycle. It should have. I waited through the count I'd built in my head, and nothing happened. Then, it kicked on late again, shorter than before, and coasted down with a dry grind. I stood under the tray and looked at the wall clock so long my eyes started watering. The second hand moved clean and steady. The relay cabinet kept humming. The pulses came up through the floor every few seconds, each one just a little stronger than the last. When the minute hand edged closer, I climbed onto the chair. The seat wobbled under my boots. I reached up and grabbed the cable tray with both hands. Cold steel, rough edges. The tray flexed a little when I tested it, but the ceiling brackets held. I shifted my grip wider and bent my knees, ready to pull up. The fan stayed dead. The clock ticked over. I hauled myself up, got my weight on my arms, and lifted both feet clear of the chair just before the minute turned to 4:17. The first pulse hit instantly. It wasn't the soft thump from earlier. The floor rose under me in a slow swell, like something underneath pressed upward with a broad shoulder. The concrete didn't crack, but the whole slab domed just enough to see. Red sand rippled in lines across the room, lifting and settling in narrow ridges that ran from the rear wall toward the door. The rear hatch slammed up from outside with a metal bang. The back wall seams clicked in sequence, left corner, center, right corner. Sharp little strain sounds like screws taking load. The relay cabinet rattled against its anchors. The chair under me rolled half an inch, then stopped when a wheel caught in a pile of sand. I locked my elbows and held on. The next swell came stronger. The floor rose, settled, rose again. Not fast, not violent, heavy, deliberate, like whatever was under the slab was pushing up to find the shape of the room. The rear hatch banged twice more. The second hit made the wall bow inward a fraction near the base before it snapped back. Red sand hissed under the wall seam in a thick line now, not a trickle. It spread in wavering patterns with each floor pulse, like the slab itself was breathing under a skin of grit. I kept my eyes on the fan housing. Rule 5 was simple. Keep both feet off the floor until the ventilation fan restarts. The fan did not restart. It sat there dead in the half-open housing, blade still, control board dark except for one weak indicator. The relay cabinet was live. The lights were still on. The fan should have been cycling because I'd dragged the chair, because the timing had slipped. Not yet, I muttered when the fan stayed dead. My shoulders were already burning. I hooked my right wrist deeper into the tray mesh and shifted my grip with my left hand. The tray flexed and gave me a shower of dust from the ceiling bracket. Another pulse rolled through the floor, directly under me this time. The slab swelled higher in the middle of the room, enough that the chair seat tilted and tapped one wheel against the panel wall. 3 hollow knocks came from beneath, straight down under my boots, so close together they felt like one thing striking 3 points. The tray shook in my hands. I sucked in air through my teeth and tightened my grip. The relay lights flickered once and came back steady. The wall seams clicked again. The rear hatch hit hard enough this time that I heard one bolt ring. The fan was still dead. Come on, I said. I looked from the fan panel to the tray to the floor and knew what I had to do. If the fan wouldn't restart on its own, I'd have to force it. The red reset tab sat low and to the right inside the open housing, just out of easy reach. From where I hung, I couldn't touch it without giving up one hand. The slab swelled again. The red sand moved in long ripples now, all of it shifting toward the center of the room where the floor bulged most. It looked wrong in a way I still can't explain, like the sand knew where the weight was before it moved. I swallowed and shifted my right arm deeper through the tray mesh until the steel bit into my wrist and forearm. I tested my hold once, lifting and settling my weight. If I drop, I'm done. My voice came out thin. I let go with my left hand. For half a second, I spun toward the wall. My shoulder lit up with pain as all my weight hit my right arm. I caught myself against the wall with my left forearm, boots hanging above the floor, toes kicking air over the top of the chair back. The next pulse hit while I was still swinging. The floor rose and the chair jumped. One wheel slipped. The tray snapped downward and bounced back. My right hand almost tore loose from the mesh. I grabbed the wall with my left palm and steadied myself, breathing hard, forehead pressed against painted steel. The fan panel was inches from my face now, but low. I had to drop my shoulder and reach blind to get inside the housing. I need one hand. Just 1 second, I muttered. I slid my left arm into the fan opening and felt around the board by touch. Hot plastic, wire bundle, metal edge. The floor swelled again and shoved the chair sideways under me, and I lost the panel for a second. The rear hatch slammed. Red sand hissed across the floor. Then 3 knocks hit from directly beneath me. The tray jolted so hard, my right hand slipped a notch in the mesh. Skin peeled off my knuckles. I gasped and jammed my wrist deeper through the steel grid before I dropped. My left hand found the red tab. It was stiffer than I expected, stuck halfway in its slot. I hooked 2 fingers around it and pulled. It moved a little, then jammed. "Move," I said, and reached for the override. I shifted my grip and got my thumb against the metal arm beside it. The floor pulsed again, slower but harder, and the slab under the chair rose high enough that the chair back nudged my shin. I pulled the tab and pushed the arm at the same time. Nothing. The fan stayed dead. I pulled harder, teeth clenched, shoulders shaking. "Start," I said. The control board clicked, but the blades didn't turn. I smelled hot dust and old motor windings. The rear hatch banged again, long and heavy, and the back wall seam snapped like a nail head pulling through wood. The floor swelled under me so high this time that I felt heat through the soles of my boots, even hanging clear. The red sand surged in a ring toward the center bulge and stopped. I yanked the tab one more time and slammed the metal arm inward with the heel of my hand. "Start, damn it!" My voice came out sharp. The fan jerked. One slow turn, then another. It sputtered, rattled, and almost stalled. I kept pressure on the arm and held the tab out with my fingers until the motor caught. The blade spun faster, then faster again, and the airflow hit my face in a sudden cold stream full of dust. "There you go," I said when the fan finally kicked on. The room changed all at once. The next floor swell came weaker and flattened faster. The rear hatch stopped hammering and dropped with one final metal thud. The wall seams quit clicking. The pressure in the room eased so suddenly my ears popped. Red sand still moved, but only in little settling slides, no more ripples pushing inward. I held onto the tray and didn't let go. The fan climbed to a full steady run and stayed there, louder than before, but smooth. I kept my left hand on the panel another few seconds, waiting for the motor to fail again. It didn't. I eased the override arm back and pulled my hand out of the housing. My shoulders were cramping so bad I could barely feel my fingers. My right forearm was numb where the tray had bitten into it. Sweat ran down my back in spite of the cold room air. The chair under me had rolled crooked, half buried in red sand, but the floor below it looked flat again. I still didn't trust it. I counted a full minute in my head while hanging there, eyes on the fan, then counted another 30 just to be sure. The relay cabinet hummed steady. No knocks from under the floor, no movement at the rear wall. The fan kept running. Only then did I lower myself. I dropped one boot to the chair seat first, then the other, testing the weight slowly. The seat wobbled, but the floor stayed still. I let go of the tray, stepped down off the chair, and stood on the concrete with my knees bent, ready for another pulse. Nothing. I moved away from the chair and leaned against the side wall, then slid down until I was sitting on the floor with my back to the metal and my legs stretched out in front of me. Red sand coated the toes of my boots and the cuffs of my jeans. My hands were shaking hard now, worse than before. My right knuckles were split where the tray had skinned them, and there was dust stuck in the blood. I looked at the wall clock and then at the fan, still spinning, realized I'd made it through the part the rules had been trying to get me to. Barely. I stayed there against the wall, breathing through the soreness in my shoulders and listening to the fan and the relay cabinet hold their rhythm. I didn't trust the room enough to close my eyes, and I sure as hell didn't trust it enough to sleep. So I sat there in the red sand and waited for daylight. I didn't move for a long time after the fan stabilized. I stayed on the floor with my back against the wall, eyes on the ventilation unit, counting the cycles and waiting for something else to shift. Nothing did. The fan ran steady. The relay cabinet kept its low, even hum. The floor stayed flat under the red dusting of sand. By the time the light outside started to turn from black to gray, my shoulders had locked up, and my right hand had stiffened around a crust of dried blood and grit. When the room looked bright enough to see the door without the overhead lights, I stood up. I went to the front wall and pulled the inner shutters open one at a time. The slats rattled up and locked into place. Morning light came through weak and cold, but it was enough. Outside, a red drift of sand sat piled against the front step, packed halfway up the lower tread like someone had shoveled it there in the dark. The yard beyond looked normal again. Fence line, gravel, my van, Brandy's tire tracks from the night before, no moving sand, no pressure in the air, just the desert at dawn. Inside the room, the red sand was everywhere it hadn't been when I arrived. Fine grains lined the wall seams, gathered under the table legs, and traced a thin ridge along the back wall where the hatch sat outside. It had worked into the corners and under the relay cabinet like powder. The relay equipment was still running, green indicators steady across the replacement module. The work order problem was solved. I knew that now was the least important thing I'd done in that building. I checked the wall clock, then the fan, then the power panel. I closed the fan housing and wiped my bloody knuckles on a rag. I added one last note to the site log in the same clip style as the other entries, enough to match what the night had become, not what dispatch had called it. Then I packed my gear carefully, lifting everything, not dragging anything, even though the floor felt dead and ordinary again. I heard Brandy's SUV before I saw it, tires on gravel, engine low and steady. She pulled through the gate and parked in the same spot as before. I opened the front door before she could unlock it from outside and stepped down onto the steel stair. The red drift held against the bottom step, crusted on top from the morning air. Brandy got out, jacket zipped, same flat expression, same notebook already in her hand. She looked at the step first, then the seams around the building, then the vent housing on the left wall where the exterior duct ran. Only after that did she look at me. "Sand reached the step?" Brandy asked. "Yeah, twice," I said. She wrote that down without reacting. Then she stepped past me into the room and scanned it in one quick sweep. Her eyes paused on the power panel, then the fan unit, then the sand line at the rear wall. She didn't ask why there was blood on my knuckles. She didn't ask why the chair was under the cable tray or why the floor had a red film over half the room. She treated it like a checklist. "Fan restart time?" she asked. "A little after 4:17, I told her. Another note in the book. Then she asked how many main cuts and whether the rear hatch opened fully. I answered. 2 cuts, no full breach. Hatch lifted. Sand intrusion from rear seam. She wrote all of it down in that same small, neat handwriting and never once asked if I was hurt or tired or done taking jobs like this forever. When she finished, she checked the relay cabinet last. Not first, last. She looked at the replacement module, the green lights, and the log entry, then gave a short nod like that part was mostly paperwork. She signed something in the site log, closed it, and set it back on the table. "County crew will handle the hatch bolts," she said. It was the first thing she had said all morning that sounded remotely like a normal work handoff. Then she stepped outside and locked the front door behind me while I stood in the yard with my tool case and watched. No thank you, no warning for next time, no next time, period. I got in the van and drove out through the gate without looking back at the building. Once I hit the highway and had signal again, I called Sierra. I didn't wait until I got back to Bullhead. I wanted the payout code while the night was still fresh enough in my head to stay angry. She picked up on the second ring. I told her the module was swapped, the site log was done, and the county liaison had closed the handoff. I also told her the fan cycle slipped, the hatch lifted, and I had to force a manual restart at 4:17 to keep the room stable. I said all of it flat, same way she talked to me, because I wanted to hear how much of it sounded normal to her. She was quiet for a second, then said the hazard hold would clear first and the rest would need review. Review. I asked her what that meant. She said the relay work was complete, but the full repair payout was tied to site condition sign-off, and those notes hadn't posted yet. Hazard partial would clear this morning. The rest would clear later if it cleared. She made it sound administrative, like a form was missing. The partial wasn't enough. I did the math while she was still talking. It covered gas, maybe groceries, maybe one bill if I stretched it. It didn't cover Tate's full total, not after the fees rolled. I told her that. She said she understood, and that was the end of the call. I drove straight to Mojave Tow and Hold and parked outside the office with the van engine running for a minute because I didn't want to go in and hear the number again. Tate was at the counter when I walked in, reading something on a clipboard. He looked up once, saw me, and didn't bother pretending I was there for good news. I told him I had a partial and asked what the new total was. He punched it into the register, turned the screen, and let me look. Overnight rolled to next day's storage just like he said it would. I was still short, not by a little either. I stared at the number, then at him, and he gave the same small shrug he always gave when money and timing beat somebody. No speech, no sympathy, just business. I was about to leave when he set the clipboard down and nodded toward the yard door. "Truck's still here, but you need to see the inside," Tate said. That got me moving. We walked through the lot between rows of impounded cars and contractor pickups. Chain-link shadow cut across everything by the morning sun. My truck was in the third row, exactly where I'd seen it the day before. Front corner bent, toolboxes still locked in the bed, doors closed, windows up, no broken glass, no pry marks on the lock. Nothing touched. Tate stayed a few feet back while I unlocked the driver door. The cab looked normal for half a second. Then I saw the sand. Fine red sand dusted the seat, the center console, the floor mat, the dash seam by the windshield. Not a lot, but enough to notice immediately because it didn't belong there. It was the same color as the sand in the relay room, the same rust-red powder that had come in under the walls. I leaned in and looked closer. On the driver's seat, the sand was disturbed by two compressed trails, side by side and slightly curved, as if something heavy and soft had rested there for a while and then slid down off the cushion toward the floorboard. Not footprints, not handprints, no shape I could name, just pressure marks in the dust, smooth-edged and wrong. My hand was still on the doorframe when it happened. 3 faint pulses came up through the soles of my boots from the dirt lot under me. Not sounds, not knocks, pressure, upward, evenly spaced, light but unmistakable. I stood there looking at the red sand on my seat and the dragged marks leading down into the footwell, and I didn't move. I didn't hear the knocks anymore. I felt them through my boots.